All right, back here with Hyland Harris, and it's early July now, and to Armstrong fans, July 4th, of course, signifies what we call his traditional birthday. July 6th is the 49th anniversary of his passing, and it's kind of an important time for us at the Armstrong house because the house is kind of frozen in time from this 69 to 71 period. And it's also a period we kind of focus on because it's probably the years that he spent more time in the house than the previous almost 25 years. So, can you take us through like the last couple of years? And Louis goes into intensive care in 68 and 69. And then what does the house mean to him? What does Lucille mean to him? Going back to performing, practicing. Just take us through those last couple of years of him kind of going out on his shield.
I think like once his health started to go into decline, that's when like Louis's house really became like a home, as opposed to like a pit stop. And so I think that's really when like the neighbors started seeing him more often, and I think like the relationship between him and Lucille kind of changed a little bit. I mean, at one point she had to like change bed sheets at one point, right? Like he was really ill.
He was, yeah.
And it's kind of funny because like when Louis moved there in the 40s, that was his home. He had decided that he found a place, an anchor, so to speak. And Lucille was always kind of looking around, like bigger places and things like that. And Louis was always away. He was away 200-300 days a year or whatever. But he died at home. He passed away at home. Whereas Lucille was home all the time, and then she passed away on the road.
Right.
And it was kind of like this weird like flip-flop. And I think, but when Louis passed away, I think that's when that really became Lucille's home. Like she really, like she didn't move. We always say how like Louis didn't move to bigger places and blah, blah, and but Lucille didn't move like for 12 more years in the 70s when New York was kind of a little less fashionable. And so the house really took on a different feeling. You really feel that when you go from the first floor to the second floor. Like once you get to the second floor, it feels a little bit more intimate. On the first floor, you want people to see your fancy bathroom and your kitchen and things like that. And upstairs, it just feels different. And then people realize, oh, Louis passed away here, and he wrote his books here, and this is where he spent his last few years. And you do feel that in the house, and people come away from the tours having a different feeling about that house. They're hit with this insane kitchen, but when they get to the second floor, or even when they see like the chairlift, then they understand there's like a bookend to life, and like now we're going to kind of approach Louis's bookends. And we mentioned it before. Professionally, he kind of had like an uptick. His outlook on how he was being perceived changed dramatically. And I don't think that really would have happened if he was out there constantly driving I think it took a little bit of him being at home and being able to settle in a little bit, to understand his importance and his legacy. And because if he was just out there doing it all the time, I think it would have been in the backdrop,
Yeah, because I mean, he really didn't have a break between 1923 and 68, and there was something about him disappearing for over a year that I think it let everybody realize we almost lost something special.
Right.
But when he comes back, to performing, at first it's just going on TV, just telling stories, just singing. Doctors telling him not to play the trumpet, but as we know, he practiced every day at home in that period. you know, what did
We have recordings of that.
we do? Like, what did playing the trumpet, like, you know, it sounds like a general question, but what did it signify to him in this period? Like others, like Roy Eldridge, Buck Clayton, doctor said, "You're done." They said, "We're done," and they lived 20 more years and never touched their horns again.
Right.
But Louis couldn't do that. Why? What was the allure?
Didn't he say something like "my spirit is in the horn," or what?
Yep.
What was the term that he?
It was my whole soul, my spirit,
My whole
everything.
soul.
Yeah. Yep. Yep.
Right. And then, you know, like the famous argument with Lucille, he's like, the horn comes first. So I think he put so much of himself into that trumpet. Like this was really his mode of expression. So we know he liked to tell jokes and he was a good actor and things like that. But, you know, he would not have had an acting career without being a great musician first. That's what really opened those doors. And he knew that. He knew that. Also, I think, you know, we talked about Bill Robinson, but also like the one trumpet player that he was always in awe of, King Oliver, like he died broke. And I think that really had a big effect on Louis, on his work ethic, uh, his inability to stop. I think that had a big, for me, I interpret that as, man, like the one guy who I really look up to on all fronts. And this is the way he went down. I think that really planted a seed in him. And
You can't find many examples of Louis bad mouthing King Oliver, but he definitely does talk about how he didn't take care of his teeth, and so he didn't take care of his
right,
chops. He had no business sense, didn't trust managers, so he never had a manager to help make the decisions. You know,
right.
turned down the
Mhm.
Cotton Club, and
Bad investment.
yeah, all that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, you know, Oliver is this kind of father figure and the biggest influence, probably musically and even otherwise in his life. But it's also this cautionary tale of, you know, don't end
Right.
up selling vegetables on the side of the road, you know.
It's crazy. It's crazy. And I think that had a big effect on him. And, you know, I think in Lewis's later years, he's comfortable. He, you know, everything's being taken care of, but he was still itching to
Yeah.
get back. He was still like like this was what he was born to do. And guys like that, man, like older performers who have to keep performing, like if they're not doing it, they're gonna die. You know,
Yep.
they're gonna die. You
I remember,
know,
I remember seeing BB King a few years ago, and you know it was at the end, and I could even see through the stage door. You know, the bus was right out there, and they wheeled him up the ramp, and they wheeled him right out when it was over, right back onto the bus. But it just, you know, when he was out there, it just seemed like, you know, he needed it to breathe. It was like oxygen. Like, you know,
right,
I'm going to keep doing this. And once he couldn't do it anymore, you know, you knew the end was
right.
near.
And it's the
Um,
same story. It's like you know, you see people backstage, and you're like, are they gonna be all right? And as soon as the lights hit them, you know, they're 20 years younger.
right.
And Lewis had that. He had that. Also, just the fact that even in those later recordings, that he was still, you know, looking for different modes and different kinds of music. Like he was still doing that. Like he wasn't resting on his laurels at all. He wasn't doing Sleepy Time Down South on records towards the end.
No?
He was really trying to do some other different things. And so in his thinking, you know, when you know, like when you're a master, like on that level, like one of the reasons why you're that great is because you don't afford yourself an inch to think negatively at all. Like it's 100% in one direction, or it's if it's 99%, then you're already failing. And you get that with him. You get that tremendously with him. Like just the conviction is
Oh.
ridiculous.
Now, what about some of the things he does at home? you know, Lucille renovates the den so he could spend more time with his hobbies. But there's also the garden, buying the property next door. There's the brick wall. There's, you know,
Uh-huh.
what are some of the changes to the house, and what are some of the things that he's invested in, involved in those last 2 years, in terms of the house and the community and that kind of stuff.
Well, in that Panassier film, you can kind of see them working on the garden there, and so you can see, you know, I guess it's his or Lucille's idea of like expanding the garden. Like you get the feeling like they're digging in their trenches. Like this is really the home. This is really, we're really going to enjoy this space. So like you see that. The house went through tremendous changes during that period, and didn't he stay at like a hotel in the area while they did they like over
Yeah.
near LaGuardia or something?
Yeah, while he was in the hospital the first time in '68, either he wrote a letter or Lucille wrote someone. We have a letter somewhere mentioning that the house is being renovated, and you know, if you needed them, they were staying at, I forget the name of the hotel, but yeah, they had to leave the house. It was that extent of renovation.
Right, right, and you know, like the house, like particularly something like the kitchen, like that was 1970 or 71.
The invoice says it was finished in March 1970. Yeah.
Okay, alrighty. Like the kitchen, you know, like that color was kind of popular at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And just like the wood paneling, that was really popular like at that period. So it's really, it really captures that, like Louis, like Lucille, they were just still modern. Sometimes you go into people's houses and you can see like where their lives stopped, like when the kids moved out. But you can tell by the furniture or the paintings that are on the wall. Like you could see where they're like, okay, like there's no way. Lewis's house, it just kept going. It just kept moving forward, like up until the end. I mean, after Louis died, Lucille was still making changes to the house. So like the house is kind of, part of it is trapped in time. There's but there's also the element of, it's like it was always in flux. It was always moving. Pictures of the house like in the 40s are completely different.
Completely different. The walls are different. Everything's
Everything,
different.
everything.
What's the if you could tell, for those that don't know, the story of the brick facade and the brick wall, and the garden, just for those who've never been to the house, you know, kind of Lewis's last little gifts to the neighborhood.
Well, the house originally, like in the 1910 picture, uh, before the Armstrongs lived there, had brick, and then eventually it had like wood. It had like the wood clapboard, and Lucille, she started to brick face the house, and I mean, anybody who's been to the house or they've driven by or walked by, like that house stands out. It looks like, where did this brick, you know, he used to call it the Citadel, right?
Yep.
Like where did this thing come from? And the story is Louis he didn't really approve of that, because a lot of his energy went into blending in with the neighbors as opposed to being kind of like bourgeois or outside of. So the story is that he knocked on all the doors. He offered to brick face the entire side of the block. And our next door neighbor, Selma, her mother, you know, because Louis was towards the end of his life, they were like, man, here's this old guy and he's sick, and so Selma's mother said, well, just do the front there. So you can see like the brick face from Louis's house kind of extend past his property, only to like in front of Selma's house to a certain degree. And then the garden, like again, the garden was expanded. Lucille and Louis, they planted those trees around the perimeter. And today we historically landscape it to be similar to the way it was when Louis had passed away. And we like to end the tours in the garden because that's where Louis had his last birthday party. You know, he had been very ill. He had surprise birthday party. It was about a dozen people or so were there. Was Tyree Glenn, was he one of them?
Yep, Tyree was there. Yep.
Tyree. And then, and that was on July 4th, 1971. And then that's when, you know, Louis got a new burst of energy. He said he's going back on the road, get the band back together, rehearsal start as soon as possible, and then he passed away. And so I think it's very appropriate that we end the tour like in the garden, because this is where Louis was going to extend. This was the starting point of him extending his career and his life and getting back to like what his mission was. So it's a very touching part of the tour, actually. When people think it's over and we're like, we're not done yet, like, yeah, the story keeps going.
And when you consider what that garden has hosted over the years, yeah, the amount of school kids, the amount of concerts and jazz fans and bands, Arvell Shaw's band for years, and, you know, right up to John Faddis, right, and everybody else, you know, if they didn't get that garden in there and purchase that property, you know, I don't think any of that would have been possible. So it's like doing that made it possible for literally tens of thousands of school kids and music fans to experience music in Louis Armstrong's backyard. It's amazing.
Yeah, I was at a friend of mine's, and his house out in Long Island, and his brother-in-law, who was like kind of a big wig on Sirius Radio now, he was like, "Oh man, I've been to concerts in that garden when I was a kid." And I was like, "What are you talking about? Like, the house wasn't even open back then. Like, I didn't believe him." And then Michael Cogswell's like, "No, like before the house had opened, we were giving concerts in that garden for many years."
That was the first program, yeah.
Well, so what year did it start?
I think 88, I believe, yeah. So it was
88.
15 years of Pops' Tops concerts before the museum was even open.
Yeah, but they walked the kids through the house.
Right.
They walked them through, but there was no tours at the time.
Right.
And I mean, who's been there? We know Arvell started it, and I remember when Roy Hargrove did it.
Yep, and David Oswald, John Faddis, Ray Vega, Arturo O'Farrell did it. Alfonso Horn's done it. Wycliffe Gordon did it early on. There's one. Yeah, Big Nick Nicholas did it early on. We've been lucky, and the kids have been lucky. Arvell had it locked down for about the last 10 years of his life, but he would bring in Byron Stripling and Frank Owens and all these great musicians. So,
oh man,
yeah. So I think,
and it's always been the same amount of students. About was it about 2,500?
I think 1,500 was a 250 a show, 2 shows a day for 3 days, so about 1,500. And so multiply that by 32 years.
Right.
So
right.
That's a lot of.
That's our most popular program. I think it's planted the most seeds, and even Chris, who works with Steve Jordan, he said he went to one as a kid, right?
Yeah, it's unforgettable. We have students who come back all the time and bring their parents back and remember that experience. And I think that's all that's all Louis would have wanted, because some people say, at the end there, he knew, he was putting on a brave front. He invited the media over to his house 10 days before he died to play the trumpet for them, and promised that he was going to go around the world. And called his manager and said, "Get me a booking." But other friends like Zudi Singleton and the trumpeter Chris Clifton, they all said that he knew that the end was near. And so I do think that these things he does in those last 2 years with the garden, the brick, and the den, and making these tapes right up to the day before he died, I think he was in almost overdrive to make sure that the house, the legacy, everything was going to be ready for his passing. Because it's in August of '71. August of '71, Lucille gives this press conference saying, "One day I'm going to open the house as a museum and people can come and see how Louis lived." And he always said this was the home he dreamed of, and the Waif's home, and blah, blah, blah. So, I think he's half of his brain is like, I got to get back on the stage. I got to get my chops together. I got to keep performing. But the other half is, if this is it, I got to make sure that everything's intact and the legacy is ready.
I mean, I knew Lucille. Now, Lucille she was working on making this into a museum almost immediately after he passed away.
I mean,
From day one.
that first interview is August of '71, and then on the tour we always play that clip from the interview. That's about '73, in which she's saying, she says right out, I'm gonna start a memorial museum with all of Louis' things in there. And so, you know,
Right.
this was not a surprise. I mean, it took years. I mean, we're knocking on the next year will be the 50th anniversary of his passing.
Right.
But when, you know, it wasn't a surprise. You know, the house was landmarked during Lucille's widowhood. She gave all these,
1977.
yeah. And so it was going to happen. You know, it took the efforts of Michael Cogswell and Queens College and the Louis Armstrong Educational Foundation and so many people, you know, the Queensborough president, Helen Marshall, everything had to come together at the right time. But, you know, you've said it before too, we're just basically carrying out Louis and Lucille's wishes. You know, they set it up.
Right. It's true. It's true. Also, it's kind of a perfect storm. Because, you know, like if Helen Marshall wasn't there and if the foundation wasn't there and Queens College, like if just one, even something simple as like Selma being next door,
Right.
just keeping an eye on the house, or Betsy, you know, like if all those things weren't in place, there'd be a plaque outside, but that might be it, you know?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of plaques around the city, but there's only one museum like this. So, you know, I think that's one of the reasons why, like the staff and everything, they take this job it's like a mission statement. It's just not a job, because they understand that just how fragile an institution like this it really is. But in order for it to be there, like just to get to the point where we are now, like so many things had to have been in place, and it's a miracle, knock on wood, that like that we even have the museum, you know.